I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 126 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. I would like to remind all members and the witnesses as well that they wait until I recognize them by name. Now, we will be resuming our study on Canada's advancement of a two-state solution. And pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 19th, we are going to continue on with that. I'd like to welcome our witness. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome our two witnesses today. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, we're grateful to have with us Mr. Louis-Martin Homais, Legal Advisor and Director General of the International Law Bureau, as well as Ms. Rebecca Netley, who's Executive Director of the Accountability, Human Rights, and United Nations Law Division. Welcome to you both. I understand you each have just one. Okay, Mr. Homais, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, honorable members. As a consult, I thank you for the invitation to appear before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development in the context of Canada's promotion of a two-state solution. Please allow me to start with a few points on international law with regard to the recognition of a state. Under customary international law, the constituent elements of a state include a permanent population, a defined territory, or relatively defined, a sovereign government, and independence from any other state. However, the application of these elements could pose a number of issues in specific situations. Existing states may have different sovereign opinions on whether these elements are present in a particular case. It is therefore up to each state to conduct its own assessment and take its own decision on the topic. Moreover, even when all these elements are present, there's no obligation whatsoever for another state to recognize an entity as a state, considering that the legal considerations only form part of the factors influencing such a decision. Ultimately, the decision on the recognition of a state is a deliberate political act on the part of another state.
In Canada, the authority to recognize new states is exercised by the federal executive under its prerogative over the conduct of Canada's foreign relations. I would note that the approach to recognition is generally characterized by caution. Indeed, states extend recognition in order to remove uncertainty, not to create it. Where Canada decides to recognize a new state, it does so clearly and expressly. The manner of the recognition is also a political decision and can take a variety of forms, such as the exchange of diplomatic communications or an official statement by the government, and other forms. Moreover, the level of political, diplomatic, trade, economic, or other engagement that Canada may decide to have with the state, which it recognizes, is also a political decision. Ma collègue, Maître Netley et moi-même, vous remercions de votre écoute.
Netley and myself, we thank you for your kind attention and would gladly take any questions from you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Homais. We start off with Mr. Chong. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci à nos témoins pour votre témoignage.
Thank you to the witnesses for appearing and for your opening statement.
You said something that I think is very important for the committee. You answered a question that I was going to ask, which is whether or not, from the Government of Canada's perspective, the recognition of statehood is a political or a legally determined decision, and you've clearly answered in the former rather than the latter. So clearly, as you said, it's the recognition of statehood is something that should be approached with caution, something that should be done clearly and deliberately, but that ultimately it is a deliberate political decision, and the manner of recognition is also a deliberate political decision. So I appreciate that clarity from you in your opening remark on that. I have a question concerning, I was going to ask what factors what criteria would be in place, would have to be met in order for the recognition of statehood to be obtained, but I think you'll probably answer by saying it is a deliberate political decision of the political executive, so I won't ask that question. Maybe I'll ask a different question. Broadly speaking, is it the department's view that the Oslo Accords are broadly the path for a two-state solution?
Mr. Chair, I thank the member for his question. I take it now, it relates to the Oslo Accord, which are very much a political arrangement reached by the State of Israel and the PLO in order to create a Palestinian Authority. Given the very political nature of the arrangement, I wouldn't be able, as the legal advisor of the department, to express a view about whether that is the path or whether it is a path. Clearly, at the time of its conclusion, it appeared to be a reasonable path that the parties had agreed upon and were entering into. Obviously, history shows us that it has not led to what the parties had contemplated in the first place. It's a complex agreement. Like it's about setting a number of preliminary steps, interim steps over a period of time. It was like over 5 years, with the view ultimately to agreeing to a more permanent arrangement.
Unrelated question. There was discussion in our last meeting or 2 meetings ago about the Montevideo Convention.
Yes.
Canada is not a signatory to that convention, is it?
No,
does Canada consider that to be, you elucidated 4 criteria as to what constituted statehood. Is that something you've taken from the Montevideo Convention, or is this?
Correct, because we are not a party to the convention itself. And many countries are not party to that convention, but basically what it lists as criteria also forms part of custom, international customary law. So we see ourselves as looking at those criteria for the recognition, but obviously it's not as though you meet the legal tests and therefore you have a state. There is an eminently sovereign decision by other states. Obviously, taking into consideration those elements, it's been well-established practice over time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We now go to Mr. Alghabra. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Omei and Ms. Netley, thank you very much for being here this afternoon. And I also want to echo what my colleague, Mr. Chong, has said. Thank you for your clarity with your statement. And I promise you to try to stay away from asking you any questions that might delve into the political realm. So I want to ask, I know the answer, but I want to ask it in a different way. Are there any legal impediments for the government of Canada to recognize the state of Palestine?
based on practice, based on customary international law, the criteria are there, and it is totally available for the government to make an assessment based on those criteria. It could also look into other elements that it wants to take into consideration. It's not an exhaustive list. Now, if they are, as I mentioned in my preliminary statement, there could be factual situations that warrant additional elements being added into the mix, such as political considerations or an analysis of where the entity that seeks to become a state under those criteria is in relation with its neighbors, with the region. So these are additional elements. But in terms of qualifying them as impediments, I wouldn't see that as such.
Okay. Do you know of any of our allies who are either considering the recognition or have recognized the state of Palestine?
Well, there are a number, Chair, there are a number of countries that have already made that recognition public. I am not tracking from a legal advisor's perspective the number of countries precisely, but there is on public record, there are a number of countries that have made that actually quite you're above the hundreds.
I would appreciate it if you're able. I don't expect you to know off heart, but if you're able to send back to committee the list of countries that have either officially recognized the state of Palestine or are currently contemplating or considering it. Another question for you. So for example, we know Norway, Ireland, and Spain recently announced it. Can you tell the committee how they manifested that recognition? What steps did they take after making that political decision?
Chair, that is a very interesting question, and it sort of illustrates what I mentioned in my statement. There are different ways of doing that. There's not an instruction booklet that indicates how a state can declare its recognition of a new state. What's sought by international law is clarity and absence of ambiguity on the matter. For those countries, as far as I could see, they made very official public statements, outward statements to the international community to indicate that they were taking that step. In terms of their internal communication, I mean by internal, how they transacted between themselves, the recognizing state, and the state of Palestine, that I would not be familiar with what they did. But normally, an exchange of diplomatic communication, diplomatic note, exchange of communications between foreign ministers or heads of government, heads of state. Again, that's how it's done. It's normally an agreed arrangement between the two entities. But how it was done precisely by Norway or Spain or Ireland or Slovenia, that I am not privy to the detail of that. But I would anticipate that's how they did it, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So now we go to Mr. Bergeron, 4 minutes, sir.
Merci beaucoup. Et merci,
thank you very much, and thank you both. Thank you both for your comments, your opening statements, which were very clear. In an advisory opinion published in July 2025, the International Court of Justice indicated that the occupation of Palestinian territory by Israel was illegal or illicit. And they added that states have the obligation to not assist to maintain the situation created by the illicit presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Now, in your opinion,
Canada, au terme du traité de libre-échange
Canada,
conclu entre le Canada et
based
Israël,
on the free trade agreement entered into with Israel. Do you consider any products produced in these occupied territories? Do you think that this is a form of assistance created as a result of the presence of Israel in this occupied Palestinian territory? Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank the member for the question. It is a very relevant question in the context of the advisory opinion of the court. Just to give you a small preamble on this consultative advisory opinion, this is a non-binding opinion. These are issues these were questions that were raised by the United Nations General Assembly to the court on the situation of the occupied Palestinian territory by Israel. As you mentioned, the court has issued its opinion and talked about the illicit nature of Israel's practices on these territories, and equally included a section on the obligation of third-party states in connection with the obligations that the court deemed to have been violated by Israel as a result of its practices and policies. A number of aspects on which the court ruled has to do with peremptory obligations under international law, the jus cogens, which means that these obligations require that all states adhere or obey this principle, not just Israel, but all states. Under these circumstances, it means that countries such as Canada need to conduct an assessment of their enforcement of these obligations. You mentioned the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. The agreement, and I'm not an expert in international trade, but I know enough to be able to state, Mr. Chair, that this treaty is designed in order to have a specific definition in its implementation when it comes to trade. It mentions when it comes to Israel that the treaty is only applicable where customs laws, the customs laws of Israel are applicable. It doesn't make reference to a specific territory. And based on the Oslo agreements, this allows for the enforcement of customs laws beyond the occupied territories, for instance. And this allows the products from these occupied territories to enjoy
expression,
to be considered under this treaty. So this is a precautionary measure that was taken in order to avoid all sorts of ambiguities, such as the one you just raised. And now, when it comes to determining whether this could be subject to review on the part of to be reviewed by my colleagues who are experts in international law, I believe so. But to tell you the nuance when it comes to the definition of the enforcement of this treaty takes into consideration that aspect. We deemed, and this is not Canada's obligation, and it did not start in July when the court issued this advisory opinion, even though it's non-binding on Canada. Of course, Canada needs to look at this, review this agreement. This was an approach that was already undertaken by Canada in its negotiations on the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, while taking into consideration this challenge which is raised by the court itself. Did I address your question, Mr. Chair? I hope that the member will ask a follow-up question if I did not satisfactorily address his question. Well, maybe I will not have that opportunity.
Madam McPherson, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today and sharing your expertise. And I will also try to ask you questions you can answer, but forgive me if I stray. But I want to be very, very clear. The first question that I want to ask is something that you spoke about at the very beginning. So the decision to recognize the state of Palestine is a political choice. This is something that could be done by the minister without delay. It's possible legally.
Well, as to the time it takes to make the decision, I wouldn't be...
the decision to do it it requires just that political will.
The decision by Canada as a state to recognize another state is a matter that can be taken now at the moment of the government's choosing.
You need a letter and you need a microphone, right? Okay, well, then I'd like to have a quick conversation about some of the consistency with regards to how we do this. So we know that Canada was amongst the first to recognize Kosovo's. That they cited, Canada at the time cited human rights violations, stability, and the principle of self-determination. So from your perspective, is there a rationale, a legal rationale, any reason why this government has failed to apply the same principles to Palestine, where systematic human rights abuses, illegal settlements, and occupation have continued for some time? It does look very much like we have chosen to respect the right to self-determination for some, but not for others. I wonder if you have a comment on that.
Chair, maybe to start with the end of the member's question, the issue of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people is a matter that government has on the record for a period of time. There's no issue about that with respect to the Palestinian people. The question of the timing of the government's decision, again, that is a political question. As the legal advisor of the department, I wouldn't be able to speak to those political consideration. But the criteria that are normally taken into account by a state to make such a decision are available for the government. And I would not want to suggest that the way the government has made its decision on previous recognitions of state to bind the government on future ones.
Of course, it wouldn't bind the government, but one would question why different decisions are made in different places. And I know one of the arguments that has been given is that the government needs to be cautious and it could be destabilizing in the context. However, when we recognized Kosovo, the recognition was seen as a step towards stabilizing the Balkans. Yet in Palestine, after decades of displacement and violence, we continue to have one of the world's longest standing crises. So I'm wondering how that claim of promoting global stability while refusing to recognize Palestine would be appropriate.
Chair, I would love as legal advisor to be able to offer a satisfactory answer to the member, but I'm getting into the realm of policy and politics. I believe the next panel after that might be able to offer additional guidance on that.
Thank you. That's good for me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We next go to Mr. Hoback. You have 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, witnesses, for being here. This is fascinating. I'm just kind of curious. We talk about political choice as being the end decision made on a statehood, but there has to be some backing information to make that political choice, to actually go and say, okay, we're going to make the political choice to do this. What types of things would you like to see in the legal aspects that would go into that decision before it's made?
Chair, when a state makes a decision about recognizing a new state, it wants to achieve, a decision that is clear, that provides that certainty, not just for the new state itself, but also for our citizens in our ability to interact people to people and have different kinds of relationships. So in customary international law, which is like the source of international law that stems from practice of states, elements about having sufficient governmental authority over a relatively well-defined territory and an absence of challenge from other states. These are the kind of elements, as I mentioned in my preliminary statement, that would be looked at. But this is...
So then in that scenario, So that would be a negotiation between the two parties deciding on statehood, would it not?
No, it's not a negotiation. It's a sovereign appreciation by the recognizing state.
But to have a clearer picture, if there was negotiations, if there was an agreement to move forward, then the political decision would be relatively simple, would it not?
If there was a negotiation in terms of certain political considerations,
two come together saying this, we agree that this is the actual geographic location. We agree on the rule of law. We agree on how we're going to respect each other, plus many other things that would come into play into that agreement. Wouldn't that be a better basis to achieve statehood than trying to just declare it and then trying to find out a way to get to that position somewhere later?
Yeah. Chair, this is a very good question. I think, if you go back to the early 90s, that was the plan with the Oslo Accord, is that there was going to be an agreed track between the two sides and allow them to have sort of a transitional phase, and then over time identify the more permanent elements of a new state, including territory, including government, transfer of jurisdiction. It didn't go about the way it was contemplated. So the negotiation in that instance happened between the two main players. In terms of negotiation between Canada and those players, again, that's not a
well, we would be watching it, I assume. We would be necessarily not a part of it, but we'd be using that as the...
Oh, it could very much be a consideration taken by government. Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned, it's not an exhaustive list of considerations.
I think I ran out of time.
Thank you. I'm afraid you're out of time. We now go to Madame Châtel. You have 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And before I ask my questions, I'd like to wish a warm welcome to our colleagues, Mr. Ome and Ms. Netley. My colleague, Mr. Gabra, who asked a few items of information, like a list, and I know that our formidable analysts would need those by November 19th. I hope we can get that information by then. My first question has to do with the legal implications of recognizing the State of Palestine for Canada, especially in terms of its commitments under the peace agreement in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the member for her question. Now, with regard to the legal implications for Canada, the subsequent consequences, if Canada were to recognize the State of Palestine, obviously, the relations between Canada and this new state would be guided by international law and in its entirety, and all the different obligations and courtesies which exist between states. Now, with regard to issues concerning the peace process in the Middle East, I think I should save this question for my colleagues on the next panel. But from the point of view of Canada's obligations regarding the peace process, from what I know, there's really no firm obligation on the part of Canada under this process, this peace process. But from the point of view, from a political foreign policy and foreign policy point of view, there will be considerations both on Canada's side as well as other countries regarding the progress on this peace process. I mentioned a moment ago, answering the previous member's question, I referred to the principle of self-determination of peoples. And of course, this is one thing that we need to take into consideration, the fact that this principle is a peremptory, a rule in international law. No country can no country can divest from this norm. And from that point of view, that would be my way of addressing the member's question, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And if I still have some time left, I know that the Palestinian Authority is currently undergoing significant reforms. Can you talk to us about these reforms and its role in the recognition of Palestine as a state?
The volume was low at the beginning of the question, so I couldn't hear the. Est-ce que je pourrais entendre?
You were essentially over time.
Can I hear the question again, please, Mr. Chair?
Le début de la question.
The beginning of the question, please. So the Palestinian Authority is currently undergoing some reforms right now, and I wanted to know if you could talk about these reforms and its impact on the peace process. Once more, that question belongs to the political arena rather than the legal arena, but I can give you a list of the states that have acknowledged the state of Palestine. We currently have 145 out of 193. But in the brief, we will have further details on the list of countries, right? Yes, we would be able to provide you that. It's quite significant as a number. Thank you.
We next go to Mr. Bergeron, a minute and a half, sir.
I'll start with a political statement that will take us on the legal front. Some say that what harms Canada's credibility on the international scene is the fact that we are not coherent, we are not consistent in terms of enforcing international law. We made reference earlier on to the advisory opinion of the International Criminal Court, and Canada is doing its best to defend the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and which is praiseworthy, but Canada was very reserved when it came to condemning Israel's assault on Lebanon. Now, from a legal point of view, do you think that this is normal in terms of when you compare that to Canada's position regarding Ukraine? I'd like to thank the member for his question, Mr. Chair. No, international law guarantees Israel's right to defend itself from foreign attacks. This is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. The attacks from Israel that came from Lebanon justifies Israel's decision to defend itself. The attack from Lebanon that hit the northern part of Israel. So it is on that basis that. So these attacks are going even further, right up to the northern part of Lebanon. So exercising the right to self-defense doesn't have a geographical limit as long as it's linked to the source of the aggression. It is incumbent on the country exercising its right to self-defense to determine the extent of its actions and what is proportionate. Well, it's interesting. Yes, this is part of the principle of the right to self-defense. So, like, as a legal expert from Canada, for me to offer an opinion on what is proportionate and necessary on the part of a third-party country, this would not be appropriate on my part because I do not have access to all the intelligence that Israel had access to before taking the decisions that it took or taking the decisions regarding its right to self-defense. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam McPherson, a minute and a half.
I hope you're as generous with your minute and a half as you were with my colleague. Thank you. I'm curious about some of the comments that you've made, but one of the things I wanted to start with, legally, the state of Palestine already exists. I think that that's an important thing that we do here is that we recognize Palestine exists. What we're talking about right now is Canada's recognition of Palestine. The state exists. So we are not creating a state. This is not what we're talking about. It's the recognition by Canada. But you talked about the right to defense. And so I have some questions for you on legal, the right to defense being a legal ability. What about the attacks on UN workers? What about collective punishment? These we also know are that innocent civilians have the right to not be punished for the behaviors of terrorists within their realm. Would you say, for example, that Israel's response in Gaza, where we have seen tens of thousands of innocent lives lost, is within the Israel's right to defense, or do you think that is collective punishment and has strayed beyond the right to defense into a war crime? I would argue a genocide.
Mr. Chair, I will take the questions one by one. On the issue of recognition of state, what is available to Canada to do is to make a decision as to whether it sees a new state in front of it with whom it can have state-to-state relations.
Which doesn't mean a state doesn't exist. It's just Canada's recognition of it.
Well, it's just Canada's recognition. It is Canada's recognition. It is a significant decision by the state of Canada until such time as Canada recognizes a new state. From Canada's perspective, there's no recognition of a new state, notwithstanding what, and as I mentioned in my preliminary statement, notwithstanding what other states or organizations may have decided with respect to that entity. It doesn't bind Canada. It's up to Canada to make its own sovereign decision on that matter.
And I hate to rush you, but I am going to run out of time. So we'll get to that last part.
Hi, you're 50 seconds over.
I'm wondering whether he could answer the question, since that was allowed for other members.
Absolutely.
Which question?
Whether or not you feel that the collective punishment, that Israel's response has been a war crime because of collective punishment and attacks on UN workers.
Well, very briefly, Chair, the right to self-defense of Israel obviously has to be exercised under the rules of international law, which is international humanitarian law, which has now a number of principles that need to be followed: necessity, proportionality, distinction. And again, as I mentioned to the Bloc Québécois member, it is not something that we, from the perspective of Canada, are able to make a complete assessment of because of information that is lacking from the open sources, but that would be.
Thank you. So we have 2 minutes remaining. Given that you are here, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you a question that has arisen on a number of occasions in our last several rounds. Could you tell me, Mr. O'May, if from the perspective of international law, it is possible to place predicates or conditions on a people's right to self-determination?
For a sovereign state to put predicates on?
Yes, on a people's right to self-determination.
Thank you, Chair, for your question. As it relates to self-determination of peoples, as I mentioned, it's a jus cogens, it's a peremptory norm of international law. It's not one that states can avoid. So I would suggest that a state seeking to put to create its own type of observance of that obligation through predicates, for instance, that would raise some questions about whether the peremptory norm is respected. The right to self-determination exists, and it's been confirmed by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion. The right exists, full stop. How it is exercised, there are different iterations for that. But in terms of putting preconditions, if I understand your meaning for predicate, to put preconditions to its exercise, I cannot see that rule except of those kinds of preconditions.
So that concludes our questions. Mr. O'May, Madam Netley, thank you very, very much for your time, for your expertise, and for your perspective on all the issues that were raised. Very grateful. So we will suspend for 3 minutes. We can resume. We're grateful for the second panel. We have Mr. Richard Arbiter, who's Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for International Security, Political Affairs Branch. And once again, we're incredibly grateful to have back Mr. Alexandre Levesque, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Europe, Middle East, and Arctic Branch. I take it Mr. Levesque already has coming to our committee in his schedule for the remainder of the year. We're very grateful you've taken the time. Would you like to just make one opening remarks? Okay. Mr. Levesque, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for welcoming me back. Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss Canada's advancement of a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I will use this opportunity to briefly describe Canada's long-standing position in support of a two-state solution and how we have responded to developments on the ground in this regard. I will flag from the outset, much like my colleague did in the previous session, that this issue is evolving rapidly and is under active consideration at this very moment. Consequently, I hope the committee will appreciate that while I will do my best to provide analysis and offer views on the various considerations, I will not be in a position to comment on any advice the department may be providing to the government. Canada's position on questions relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains, as has always been, guided by a historic commitment to a two-state solution. Support for the creation of a sovereign, independent, viable, democratic, and territorially contiguous Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in peace and security has been the standing position of consecutive Canadian governments over the decades. En 1947, le Canada a joué un
In
rôle clé en tant que
1947,
membre
Canada
du
played a
Comité
key
spécial
role
des
as a
Nations
member
Unies
of the
sur la
United
Palestine,
Nations
UNSCOP.
Special Committee on
Il a
Palestine,
été l'un des 7
UNSCOP,
membres du comité à approuver
and
le
was
plan
one
de
of the
partage de
7
la
committee
Palestine.
members to approve the
Le
partition plan
29
for
novembre
Palestine.
1947, le
On
Canada a
November
été l'un
29,
des 33 États
1947,
membres de
Canada
l'ONU
was
à
one of
voter
the
en faveur de la résolution
33
181
UN
qui
member states to
recommandait la
vote in
création
favor
d'États
of
juifs et
Resolution
arabes
181,
indépendants
which
et d'un
recommended
corpus
the creation
separatum
of
pour
independent
Jérusalem.
Jewish and Arab
20 ans plus
states
tard,
as a
à la
corpus
suite de
separatum
la
for
guerre des 6
Jerusalem.
jours de
20
1967,
years later,
le
following the
Canada a également
1967
voté en
Six-Day
faveur de la
War,
résolution
Canada also voted in
242 du
favor of
Conseil de
UN
sécurité
Security
des
Council
Nations Unies
Resolution
qui
242,
appelait à une paix
which called for a
globale, juste et
comprehensive,
durable dans
just,
le
and
cadre
lasting
d'un accord de
peace
paix
within the
négocié
framework
et
of a
d'une pleine
negotiated
reconnaissance
peace
diplomatique
agreement
entre
and
les parties.
full diplomatic recognition
En
between the parties.
1993, Israël
In
et
1993,
l'Organisation de libération de la
Israel and
Palestine, OLP,
Palestine
ont
Liberation
signé la
Organization,
déclaration de
PLO,
principe, également
signed
connue
the
sous
Declaration
le
of
nom
Principles,
d'accord
also
d'Oslo,
known as the
qui
Oslo
prévoyait notamment la
Accords,
création d'une
which
entité
provided for the creation of an
gouvernementale intérimaire en
intergovernmental
Cisjordanie
entity
et à
in the
Gaza,
West Bank
l'autorité
and Gaza,
palestinienne,
the
ainsi que
Palestinian
la
Authority,
reconnaissance mutuelle
and the
d'Israël et de
mutual
l'OLP.
recognition of Israel and the
Canada a
PLO.
pleinement soutenu le processus de paix
Canada
défini
has
par les
fully
accords
supported the
d'Oslo
peace
et a
process
toujours
defined by
soutenu
the
qu'une
Oslo
solution
Accords
négociée
and
par
has
2
always
États
maintained
est
that
le
a
seul
negotiated
moyen
two-state solution
d'atteindre
is the only
l'objectif d'une
way
paix
to achieve the
globale,
goal of a
juste et
comprehensive,
durable au Moyen-Orient.
just, and lasting peace in the
In
Middle
recent
East.
years, prospects for a negotiated two-state solution have diminished. They deteriorated significantly following Hamas's brutal terrorist attack against Israel of October 7, 2023. In light of the human toll of the Israeli military offensive in the Gaza Strip and the broader escalation in the region. This grim context has reignited discussions around the world on the prospects for a two-state solution and the path to peace. Il est clair que nous devons d'urgence construire une voie
that we must
crédible pour
urgently
parvenir
build a
à une
credible
solution à
path
2 États,
to a
dont le
two-state solution,
processus
a
ne peut pas
process
retarder
that
indéfiniment la
cannot
création d'un
indefinitely
État
delay the
palestinien.
creation of a
En
Palestinian
réponse à
state.
l'évolution de la
In
situation sur le
response to
terrain,
developments on the
le
ground,
représentant permanent du Canada aux
Canada's
Nations-
permanent
auprès des Nations
representative to the
Unies a
United
indiqué en
Nations
mai de cette année devant
indicated in
l'Assemblée
May
générale
of
des
this
Nations
year
Unies
before the
que le
United
gouvernement du
Nations
Canada
General
était prêt à
Assembly
reconnaître
that the
l'État
government
de la
of Canada is
Palestine
prepared
au
to
moment le plus
recognize the state of
propice à une paix
Palestine
durable
at the
et pas
time most
nécessairement en
conducive to a
tant que
lasting
l'étape
peace
finale du
and not
processus.
necessarily as a final step in the process.
State recognition does not negate the critical need for direct bilateral negotiations between the parties. The Government of Canada considers that key final status issues, such as the status of Jerusalem, can only be resolved through negotiations among the parties concerned in the context of a final status peace agreement. Canada has historically played a role in the search for a viable and comprehensive solution on those issues and stands ready to support new negotiations in the future. The government also believes that durable peace needs to be regional and include the full integration of Israel in the Middle East. The government has welcomed the 2020 Abraham Accords as a positive step towards Israel's integration into the region. Global Affairs Canada will continue to work with the international community to advance these efforts, keeping in mind the need for long-term security guarantees for Israel. Mr. Chair, the issue that you are studying today is one that merits thoughtful consideration and an understanding of the various implications. I hope our testimony today will contribute to this endeavor. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levesque. We now turn to the members. First member up is Mr. Chong. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clearly, the recognition of statehood is an inherently political decision for the political executive to make. And I would add that that decision is not made in isolation. from what our closest allies are doing. I note that when the government of Canada recognized the statehood of Kosovo in 2008, it did so after Canada's closest allies and our G7 colleagues did the same. Currently, none of Canada's closest allies and none of our G7 partners have recognized Palestinian statehood. And I assume, I'll make a statement, which I assume you agree with, that Canada's closest and most important ally and our most important bilateral relationship in the world is with the United States. Almost equally importantly are close allies like the United Kingdom, France, with whom we are bound by treaties such as the NATO Treaty, Five Eyes agreements with the United States and the United Kingdom, also close military cooperation, training of each other's forces, and the like. And so my question is, what would be the implications, what would be the fallout if Canada were to recognize Palestinian statehood ahead of any one of our partners in the G7 or ahead of our closest military allies in the Euro-Atlantic Alliance?
Very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Obviously, it would be very speculative of me to start commenting on A, a decision that has not yet been made by the government, and B, the incomplete information as to what like-minded partners and allies would do. What I can say, however, is that this issue is very live, not just in our capital, but discussed in a very intense way in the capitals of the very countries that you've listed. France, the United Kingdom, to cite the few, and Germany, the few European partners, others as well, Australia, New Zealand. These are very live conversations. Obviously, I don't know the kind of conversations that are taking place among the transition team that is being formed in Washington. We can expect a number of changes to the United States policy towards the Middle East. What I can say is that, of course, we're comparing notes. We're talking to each other, and we're weighing the considerations as a group of very like-minded country.
So the government of Canada is cognizant of the fact that a decision regarding Palestinian statehood is not to be taken in isolation from what our closest allies are doing.
I think it is a fair statement to say that what others are doing and how they are planning their pronouncements on this is an important consideration.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We next go to Mr. Zuberi. You have 4 minutes.
Merci pour les témoins d'être ici. And
I would like to thank the witnesses for appearing here today.
For this study. Our key goal and objective in this entire study is to ensure that each and every person in the region, regardless of ethnicity, faith, or which border they live within or out of, lives in peace and security, which is exactly the two-state solution. I'd like to ask, the uncertainty with respect to Palestine, the fact that it's not fully recognized by the international community, despite the fact that there is 149 countries currently recognizing, to my knowledge. But the fact that the international community has not moved towards recognition, the full community, has that created uncertainty and instability in the region?
Thank you for the question. I would not want to create a direct causality between lack of unanimity in the international community and the state of instability in the region.
Maybe I'll put this more precisely. Has the lack of recognition currently led to a differential type policy in the way in which Canada engages with the occupied Palestinian territories? vis-a-vis how we would engage if we recognized the state of Palestine. Think, for example, international tribunals, international bodies like UNESCO, etc.
I apologize. I'm not
following.
I'm not sure I really understand.
Currently, right now, Canada does not recognize the state of Palestine. As a result, to my knowledge, we do not respect the standing of the Palestinian territories in different instances. Would that change if we recognize the state of Palestine?
And apologies, but thank you for the clarification. Yes, obviously, with the recognition of statehood would come a number of triggers, for lack of a better term, as to what the status of the new country Canada would recognize would signify. Now, how exactly? I mean, that so many of the international instruments that link us to states are negotiated bilaterally, are part of international agreements. So it's not to say that one day you don't recognize a state, the other day you do, and they're part of all the possible agreements that you would have as part of the international community.
But the way in which we reply to those requests would change.
Pardon me?
The way in which we would reply to requests for a state to join an international body would obviously change.
Yes.
Okay. In terms of the strategic advantages that would be gained by, can you outline some strategic advantages that would be gained by recognizing the state of Palestine? In particular, us as a G7 country doing so.
Any decision that would eventually be made, and I would remind this committee that the underlying goal of the government of Canada is to promote all gestures, negotiations, posturing that will lead to a negotiated settlement between Israelis and Palestinians. And this is what international community writ large aims to do for the most part. If the government were to choose to trigger this element, which has always been part of the sandbox within which negotiations between parties was included, it would be as an incentive, as a boost to encourage dialogue and a return to a framework that has been abandoned since, that has been in decline, in steady decline since the Oslo Accords of 1993. What we've seen instead is a cycle of violence, is an expansion of settlements in the West Bank, and a denial of one another's existence in a higher and higher proportion, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side. The consideration here is, what do we need to do as an international community and for us as a country to trigger a reset and to create incentives for parties to come to the table and start negotiating in good faith and a return to a peaceful dialogue rather than the vortex of violence that we have been observing.
Can you provide us a list of countries, in particular our allies, that are currently considering state recognition?
So that are currently considering, I guess,
in any shape or form.
Right. Look, I obviously can't betray what confidential diplomatic conversations are taking place. I will say a number of our like-minded are struggling with these concepts and are reflecting on when the right time to recognize a Palestinian state would be. But I would say there's a number of NATO countries that have already done so. There's now a total of 145 countries that have recognized, but recently you saw that Norway, Spain, Ireland have been the latest one to join that group.
So we next go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 4 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. En mai
Thank you,
dernier, l'Assemblée
Mr.
générale
Chair.
des Nations
Last
Unies a
May,
adopté une
the
résolution
United Nations General
par
Assembly adopted
143
a
voix en
resolution
faveur, 9
by
contre, 25
143
abstentions dans le Canada, dans
voices in support,
laquelle
9
l'Assemblée
against,
exprimait sa conviction
including
que l'État
Canada,
de
in which the
Palestine
Assembly
remplit toutes les
expressed
conditions
its
requises
opinion
pour
that
devenir membre des Nations Unies. On a fait état
Palestine
dans le précédent
fulfills all the
panel
conditions
de
to be a
quelles étaient
state
ces
according to the
conditions.
UN, and we've
Le Canada,
discussed
que
what the
s'est abstenu, comme je le
conditions were.
disais, dans un
Canada
communiqué
abstained,
Affaires
as I
mondiales,
mentioned,
a
in
indiqué
communique
plusieurs
Global
raisons
Affairs Canada
pour justifier
mentioned
son
several reasons
positionnement.
to justify
Et
Canada's
curieusement, on
position.
parlait des colonies
And curiously,
illégales
we
et la
talked
violence
about
des colons en
illegal colonies
Cisjordanie, qui
and
augmente à un rythme
illegal
alarmant.
presence in
Souvent en toute impunité, le fait que Netanyahou a clairement indiqué, tant dans ses
West
paroles que
Bank,
dans
and
ses actions, qu'il
it
rejetait la solution à
it
deux
mentioned
États.
that Netanyahu had
Mais sur
mentioned
le fond, là,
on
est-ce que
several
la
instances
Palestine
that he rejected a two-state
remplit les
solution.
conditions
But
pour être reconnue comme un État?
truly, does Palestine fulfill all the conditions to be recognized as a state? Obviously, this is equally an extraordinarily complex question, and I don't know if this was put to my colleagues from the legal department in the panel before this one. But the assessment, as well as the decision, the political decision, which is Canada's, to determine whether or not it wants to recognize or not the state of Palestine, is not strictly linked to a list of specific triggers. In other words, several indicators may not have been met, but through a political action, the country might decide to go in that direction. Curiously, the reasons that were mentioned by Global Affairs Canada seem to justify a vote in favor of, whereas Canada abstained. So recently, the government of Canada indicated that it is ready to acknowledge the state of Palestine at the right moment in view of durable peace, even if this is not the only step towards achieving a two-state solution. Now, taking into consideration these comments in order to justify Canada's abstention when last May's decision was voted upon, when then will be the appropriate time to recognize the state of Palestine, in your view? My colleague will address this question in a few seconds, but I would like to mention that there's a very important distinction between membership at the UN and bilateral and national recognition of Canada. The triggers are different, the legal implications are equally different. With your permission, I'm sorry for interrupting you. The resolution was on the fact that Palestine fulfills all the required conditions. And you've mentioned a series of arguments which seemed to work against Israel to justify the fact that we were not recognizing the fact that Palestine meets all the conditions. And now government says we're ready to recognize at the right time possible. When will this right time come? When we've come up with a list of things which seem reprehensible in Israel's actions against Palestine. Is this not the right moment to acknowledge that state? Now, the most timely moment will be the moment when this would lead to more chances that such a recognition will contribute to peace efforts. The right moment, unfortunately, I have no answer for you regarding that. Well, let's simply say that the absence of any action on Canada's part makes it such that the war is continuing. I'll let your colleague take over. Well, it's okay if you'll allow me. The draft resolution at the UN was the fifth draft resolution on UN issues on the function of the Palestinian delegation within the UN since 1974. And each time, the idea was to grant more powers to the delegation. It was not necessarily on the question of the recognition of a state. And this time around, the idea was to add, to lend additional powers to this delegation.
MP McPherson, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for being here today and for sharing your expertise with us. I did want to start by just reminding the committee, I guess, that there have been 145 countries that have recognized Palestine, including many of our allies. I wouldn't certainly not want to say that Spain, Norway, and Ireland are not allies, but I also wanted to remind this committee that, in fact, when the Rome Statute was put into place, the U.S. never signed on. So while they are still one of our key trading partner, of course, our key ally, Canada has a history of taking decisions and taking steps that are not in line with the United States. We do not share a foreign policy. We have our own sovereignty and can make our own decisions. So I wanted to make that very, very clear. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the right of return for Palestinians. So months ago, I raised this issue with the minister. He was unable to answer my question at the time. Recent developments have demanded an urgent response. The IDF has now openly stated, we've seen in reports coming out just in the last few days, that Palestinians from northern Gaza will not be allowed to return home, which is a clear act of forcible transfer and ethnic cleansing. The systematic displacement not only steals land, but undermines any future prospect of a viable Palestinian state. What is Canada doing to condemn this blatant violation of international law? And is Global Affairs Canada prepared to speak out against this policy, or will we remain complicit through silence as this land theft and ethnic cleansing continues to shape the reality on the ground?
Thank you, as always, for the question. This is a theme, I know, a recurrent theme in this committee, and as the honourable member will have heard me say several times before, the legal determination of whether these accusations, these reproaches are met, whether these meet the legal definition, is not something that can be done lightly. It is not something that can be done expeditiously or by simple political statements. It does require a body of evidence that takes time to collect. And
we have direct quotes from Israeli officials. You know, for example, Brigadier General Cohen has recently indicated that Palestinians displaced from northern Gaza will not be allowed to return, effectively denying their right to return under international law, including Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Like, we don't need to study it because they said it. It's very, very clear.
It is. There's two things I would say to that. Because one element of a government claims something does not necessarily mean the entire government puts its weight behind it. And the second thing I would say is the return of Palestinian refugees is one of those final status issues that the international community has always recognized must be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians.
Just a second. You're saying that there must be a negotiation for Palestinians to return to northern Gaza.
Sorry, I thought you were talking about the general.
I might have misunderstood you, sir. Please go ahead.
I was referring to Palestinian refugees following the partition of Palestine, not Palestinians having been displaced as part of the current conflict. So I apologize if I made.
So you don't recognize that Palestinians that are refugees should be permitted to return to Palestine at some point?
No, that's not what I said. What I'm saying is, so again,
I'm not trying to put words into your mouth. I'm just trying to.
But if we're talking about Palestinians that were displaced out of Gaza through the current conflict, absolutely, they should be able to return home, and that's a clear position that has been made publicly by the government several times. If we're talking about the return, the return of Palestinian refugees who for generations have been displaced, that is precisely and by definition one of the final status issues that is to be negotiated even under the Oslo Accords directly between Palestinians and Israelis.
And just to clarify, one other.
Madam McPherson.
I always am.
So we now go to the second round. Mr. Epp, you're up for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you for coming before the committee. A just and lasting peace. That's where I began my questioning at the last session, and I appreciated your articulation of that in Canada's long-standing position and support for the two-state solution. That just and lasting peace must provide for dignity and security for all. Would you agree with the statement that for that just and lasting peace to be durable, that it must enjoy popular support, both within the state of Israel and within the Palestinian people?
I would say that citizens who live in Israel and Palestine must find themselves in whatever final accord would be negotiated in order to be inspired by it and trust that it is a just and lasting peace.
Thank you. You articulated in your opening statement Canada's position going back to the 1940s, the creation of the State of Israel, and where Canada positioned itself throughout. I'm encouraged actually by the fact that this issue is very alive in all of our closest allies' capitals. So I would assume that the decision on the timing of the recognition of the state is done, and you basically said that in conjunction with our allies. Over time, has Canada's consideration of its weight, not directly within the State of Israel, but the political considerations, also would take into account the relationship with our closest allies?
So yes, that would be one of many considerations.
Right, and so, again, it has been somewhat asked for Canada to step out in front of our closest allies. When I would make the statement, the claim that Canada's position and weight in the Middle East has diminished over time, even from since the 1940s, for a whole host of other reasons. Would that increase the likelihood that our allies would see us in a positive vein by stepping out and forward? Or would more caution be, or should be exercised by our government, even though there's unanimity that the state of Palestine should be recognized at some point when it leads always to that lasting and durable peace?
What I would say is there's an important line between acting in concert with like-minded and abdicating the sovereignty of our foreign policy. So committing to something only if it is done with others would be a bit of an abdication of the independence that we can exercise. As one of the members said, we have an independent foreign policy, and we can choose to act in our according to our own values and objectives. Having said this, I will reiterate that yes, one of the important considerations is whether this, whenever and if the government chooses to go that route, an important consideration would be to assess what others are doing and consider the weight of going at it alone versus going at it with a larger group of countries.
We next go to Ms. Zaid. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. My first question is, from a legal and international law perspective, is there anything stopping the Government of Canada from today announcing a recognition of the Palestinian state, should it choose to?
Our legal representative was here a few minutes ago. I don't know if that question was posed to him. I believe if it was, the answer would be, I don't believe that from a legal point of view there are restrictions on this. As I think has been mentioned, the recognition of a state is a political decision, and one that can be triggered via the usual political decision-making processes in our political system, and then communicated outwardly. I think the expression was used before as a letter and a microphone. But from a legal point of view, I don't believe there are any limitations. No.
Thank you. Does the Government of Canada agree that no one country should be allowed a veto on the recognition of any other state, whether by Canada or by any other country?
I would agree with the sentiment of that statement, but put the emphasis on the fact that as a government, we only have control over the decisions that we can make and the pronouncements that we can make. So in the case of recognition, that's why it really comes down to that political decision and how we pronounce ourselves. In other words, we cannot influence or force other countries to decide what to do with their own sovereign decisions.
Professors Mark Kirsten and Erdi Emsis told the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development that the right to self-determination is a fundamental and inalienable right that cannot be made conditional on anything. That is, the right cannot be held conditional on Palestinian governance reforms or a successful negotiation with Israel. Does the Government of Canada agree that the right to self-determination cannot be made conditional?
Yeah, it is indeed a Government of Canada position that Palestinians have the right to self-determination.
So the Government of Canada agrees that the right of self-determination cannot be made conditional.
We might get into legal definitions that take me a little bit outside of my zone of expertise, so I don't want to comment on that specifically, but I can reiterate that it is and has been Canadian government policy for a very long time that that Palestinians have a right to self-determination, yes.
What message would Canada's recognition... Done? All right, thank you.
We now go to Mr. Bergeron, a minute and a half, sir.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Last July, the G7 leaders underscored the importance of economic stability in the West Bank, and they called to Israel to return the customs revenue that had been collected for a number of years and to take away certain barriers in order to avoid further aggravating the economic situation in the West Bank. And this is in addition to other complaints raised by Canada in justification of its abstention regarding the motion, which or the resolution that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. I mean, what are we waiting to? Why are we waiting then? If you don't mind, I'd like further clarifications. What do you mean by what are we waiting for to make a move? I mean, the inaction, the fact that we're simply condemning in words the Israeli government did not stop the current situation from happening. Is it not high time we had a change of tone? And wouldn't the recognition of the Palestinian state be one of the actions that Canada would take to signify impatience in the face of all of these violations that we've mentioned? All right, thank you for your question. You're raising a question that is clearly political, and as I mentioned earlier, our role is simply to advise. And now regarding the pros and cons, the consequences, the decision rests with the government of Canada. It is up to it to take that decision. What I'd like to say is that in terms of words, words are really important, especially when a great number of countries come together to say the same words. So I'm not downplaying the pressure from all G7 countries when they require that the funds withheld by the Israeli government be released when they clearly belong to the state of Palestine. Since 1967, we've only spoken, and this is the result of it.
Question. We now go to Madam McPherson, a minute and a half.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to the witnesses for being here. I just wanted to get some clarity from you with regards to the Government of Canada's position. So, Mr. Levesque, obviously, you know about the International Court's decision that the illegal occupation of the territories is in fact illegal. Canada does have a free trade agreement with Israel. I am wondering what the implications will be on the Canadian government if we were to recognize Palestine, and are there further actions that would need to be taken with regards to the fair trade agreement? Considering that even at this point we're not adhering to international law by continuing to allow a free trade agreement that has specific indications for human rights abuses that are very clearly being committed.
This is actually a really important question, and I don't want to deflect, but I would like to defer because the legalities involved in how to interpret. I'm not a trade policy lawyer, but the implications that are part of that free trade agreement, how they would translate into a new state of Palestine, is something that is too important and too technically specific for me to comment without a strong base. So I would like to come back to that question. It is a fair.
Able to bring that back to the committee before the end of the study, and so
with pleasure,
quite quickly. Thank you. I think that's all the time you're giving me.
Thank you. Mr. Levesque, just one final question, if I may. You did suggest during your testimony that you are comparing notes with friends and allies as to the possibility of recognizing the state of Palestine. We heard from another witness that Japan, France, and the United Kingdom are currently going through some semblance of hearings or through studies to determine whether it would be appropriate to do so. However, when Mr. Zuberi asked you about that, I didn't quite get a response out of you. I was wondering if it would be possible for you to look into whether Japan, France, and UK are doing anything at the moment to examine that question and the feasibility of promoting peace by doing so. If you could get back to us in the next week as to whether any of those three countries or any other European country is doing so and examining the question, we would be very grateful if you could let us know in writing.
I would be happy to do that, Mr. Chair. I would say, to the best of my knowledge, no such public exercise such as the one you are conducting in this committee is taking place in any of those countries. Of course, like the good policy planners and functionaries of the state that they are, my colleagues in the foreign ministries of these countries are having very similar reflections as the one we are having right now. But I will endeavor to come back to you, do a little bit of research to see if any of what they're thinking is taking place in a public setting like this committee.
Or by their parliamentarians, maybe not by the government, but by other entities. Well, thank you very, very much. That concludes our questions. Again, thank you for always making yourself available to us, Mr. Levesque, and Mr. Arbiter. Very grateful for your time. This meeting's... Oh, sorry, just one last budgetary item before we leave. Is it the will of the committee that the proposed supplementary budget in the amount of $3,000 for the study of Canada's advancement of a two-state solution be adopted? Agreed. And that's it, right? Yes. Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
We've got thoughts.
Simplement une question. Qu'est-ce qui justifie ce budget supplémentaire?
So what is it that justifies this additional budget?
Want to speak to that, Sasha?
Is to cover the meals for the meetings.
Okay. Thank you.
My skin.
Thank you, everyone. Meeting stands adjourned.